and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We're continuing a streak here, a streak of two, of talking about books that I'm excited about that are from colleagues of mine and friends of mine at the American Enterprise Institute. And we didn't plan it this way, but Jim Pethokoukis' book came out the same day as my friend Jay Cost's book. And so we're just banging them out. Jay Cost, for those of you who don't know, because you've been living in some sort of subterranean gladiatorial shovel fighting competition for the last 10 years, is the Gerald R. Ford non-resident senior fellow at AEI. Not to be confused with whoever the Gerald R. Ford resident senior fellow at AEI. He's also a visiting scholar at Grove City College, one of my favorite little colleges, contributing editor at the Washington Examiner, and he's author of several excellent books on the founding era, among them James Madison, America's First Politician, and the one we're here to talk about today, the newly released Democracy or Republic, the People and the Constitution. So this is fortuitous because it has been a running theme of this to talk about the difference between this podcast, to talk about the difference between republic and democracy. And I have several close friends who have all been working on projects along these lines. I think you're the first one among my friends out of the blocks to actually get their book on this question done. So hopefully you'll successfully clear the field of all competition before they come out. Yeah. First mover advantage.
Right.
So I'm very tempted to ask you what the difference between a republic and a democracy is, but I'm assuming we're going to get to it pretty quickly, and it might even come out with your answer to my first question, is, what's your book about?
Well, my book is about the Constitution. The book came about from a series of articles or papers I wrote for the American Enterprise Institute, which was originally called The Conservative Case for the Constitution. And I had been noodling around with the idea of turning those essays into a book of the same title. But as I was working on it, I thought better of just the conservative case. I wanted to make a more broader case. So the book is really about the logic underlying the Constitution, the political theory of the Constitution. And we usually don't think about the Constitution as being a work of political theory. And for good reason. I mean, it's not a philosophical treatise. It was written by a committee, so on and so forth. But I do think there are underlying ideas that point to a particular constitutional logic. And I hadn't really, I'd seen other people talk about them, but I sort of had my own way of describing them. So that's sort of what came out. Also, just in the course of teaching, I've been doing a lot of teaching over the last 5 years or so, and having to explain, and I've been teaching high school, and having to explain to high school students how the Constitution works, and then also why it works. So that's really what the book's about. It's why the Constitution does what it does.
Okay, we will, I'm sure, return to that question. But now I got to ask you, what's the difference between a republic and a democracy?
Right. Well, I like to analogize it to Lincoln's famous phrase at Gettysburg: government of the people, by the people, for the people. A government of the people and by the people is what we would call a democracy, right? Like literally from the Greek, meaning the rule of the people. But government for the people, that's a republican idea. Republic comes from the Latin res publica, which means the public thing or the public affair. It refers to this idea that the function of the state is to serve the entire political community, not simply the people who are in charge of the state. And so there's a difference there. Democracy is a process. Republic is an end result. And I think one way you can appreciate this is that the Roman Republic, we often call it a republic, even though it was not a democratic republic. It was an oligarchic republic in the sense that the political power was concentrated among the wealthy and the older and the well-born. You could also
and the
look
few.
At,
I mean, just to be, if we're going to get all technical, oligarchy means rule of the few rather than right.
Likewise, the Italian city-states of Florence and Venice in the Renaissance were oligarchic republics. So our country is a democratic republic. in the sense that political participation is open to everybody over the age of 18, regardless of wealth or social status or whatever. Citizenship is broadly defined. But it is a republic in the sense that it channels that democratic energy in a way that is intended to work for the good of the entire community, rather than the people who happen to constitute a democratic majority in any one instance.
Right. So you can kind of say that the House is by far the most democratic of our governing institutions. And the Supreme Court is probably the most Republican of our institutions, right?
You could say that. You could likewise, you could look at, there's all sorts of institutions that are designed to check the democratic impulse. I mean, probably the best example is the Bill of Rights. I mean, the Bill of Rights is a list of things that Congress is not allowed to do. And therefore, by extension, it's a list of things that the people are not allowed to do, right? There's limits to what the people can do. And those limits point to the good of the political community, broadly defined.
Yeah, I sometimes like to point out to people, it's not exactly intellectually rigorous, but if Republican comes from res publica, meaning the public thing, it's a useful thing to contrast with Cosa Nostra, which means our thing in Italian, right? And a lot of regimes are really about whatever junta, tribe, aristocracy has power, and it's all about what's good for our thing rather than what's good for everybody else. And everybody else is a source of to be managed or a resource to be extract rents from, but their betterment is a secondary at best concern, right? And that's what a lot of tyrannical government is it's our thing, not the public thing.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think, in sort of my defense of the Constitution, the Constitution remains remarkable in the sense that it really was the first government, certainly in the West, that really got away from our thing, right? And really was committed to the public thing. England was moving in that direction and had been moving in that direction. But government, up until the United States of America, was really understood almost as a kind of patrimony from the king to his closest male heir, and it was their thing, right? And even the sort of the evolution of the English Constitution was at its core really about checking that patrimony, whereas the Americans did away with it altogether and placed complete ownership. You can see it in the first three words of the Constitution: "We the people." Right? The government is the property of the American people.
So when you hear politicians of a certain stripe get very finger waggy and sort of smug, I know it's rare to hear a politician in that mode, and they say America isn't a democracy, it's a republic. Do you cringe? Do you nod? Do you say yes, but, or do you say no, but? I mean, how do you respond to that when you hear people say it?
I cringe. I don't think it's I think that's an in-group kind of thing to say. I think that's something that a conservative says to appeal to other conservatives. It doesn't make the case to people who aren't already converted, right? And I would say as well that, when Madison, for instance, in the Federalist paper talks about the Republican principle, he refers to it as the Republican principle of majority rule. So this idea that, like the democratic, which we would call democracy, right? So our republic is anchored in the principle of democracy. It's anchored in the rule of the people. It's just under certain conditions the people rule. So to sort of create that kind of distinction is, to my mind, not helpful. I mean, I see where they're coming from with that perspective, but I don't see that as a way to persuade people who are not already convinced that the Constitution has a lot of merit.
Yeah, no, I think the in-group point is the right one. It's not quite a dog whistle, but it's like a shibboleth. It's one of these things that you say to sort of dunk on people who fetishize democracy too much, and I get it. I think people fetishize democracy too much, but at the same time, I mean, Adam White made this point to me once. I don't know if he's still. I remember him pushing back when I mischaracterized him, so I don't want to lean on it too much. But that if you go back and you read the founding era folks, or you read the Glorious Revolution era types and all the political theorists, and because republicanism was considered to be an alternative to, somewhere between an alternative to and a check on monarchy, it was translated by the ear of the listener as a nod towards democracy, right? It's just like, that's what, they didn't use the word democracy very much, but that's what it was understood as. And so this hard distinction etymologically, or as the justices would say, text, history, and tradition, leaves out that they weren't exactly synonymous, but they were closer to synonyms than antipodal sort of things, right?
Yeah, totally. And look, another thing to bear in mind too is that if you look at England, which first of all, Madison in Federalist 39, Madison basically says England is not a republic, because a republic, Madison says that a republic has to anchor all of its political institutions, all of its governing institutions have to be anchored in some way in popular sovereignty, which England did not qualify as. But England was certainly moving in that direction at the time of the American founding. But, there's an important thing to bear in mind about our own unique history, which is that historically in the old world, participation in political life was, the precondition of it was property ownership. And this was a conceit that was brought over from the old world into the new world. And there were reasons for it. I mean, there were good, objective reasons for it. Property owners have a stake in society. So, and they're also their own man, or in the monopoly, their own person. So they're not owned by anybody else. Their reasoning is their own. But in Europe, property was scarce. And so when we're talking about property ownership being a precondition for political participation, you're going to point towards a relatively narrow cast of society. But when you think about the New World, right, like in 1787, and you think about how much land is available to settle, they're like, even if they didn't realize it, and a lot of them did not, some of them did, even if the founders didn't realize it, they were effectively, like, just the nature of the American continent was such that we were always going to be moving towards moving in a democratic direction. I mean, because property was just so cheap here.
You may not be maybe unfair to ask you this, but I've always kind of wondered this, and I just never articulated before. The thing about property in the old world, going back to the Greeks and Romans, I'm asking this in the form of a question, even if it doesn't sound like it. Was the property thing a thing unto itself, a qualification unto itself, or was it seen as essentially the easiest sort of shorthand for a person of some means, of some education, of some status, and you could probably describe those people using some other metric, how many togas do they have? I don't know, right? But come up with some other thing that gets at the same thing. Like, you could have said a republic, civic participation was contingent upon being literate, and it would not perfectly overlap because illiteracy was pretty common, but it would also get at the same thing, because poor people were not literate, because there was no point in it, right? It was a shorthand. Or was it a shorthand for these other things, or was the actual ownership of property seen in and of itself as a status conferring thing? I
would say it would be a mix. If you look, for instance, at the Roman Republic, citizenship was broadly held, but there was limits. There were certain advantages to being wealthier, like for instance, the equestrian class. And the equestrians had special privileges, and their votes counted more, and things like that. That's why the Roman census was so important. But the census was, as far as I understand it, the census was defined not by land ownership, but by income and how many sesterces you made a year. So it wouldn't have been land per se. Also, if you look at the Italian city-states in the late Middle Ages, particularly Florence and Venice, which would have been the two durable ones, the citizen class would not have been predominantly the landowners. They would have been the merchants and bankers in Venice, and the traders and shipbuilders, merchants and bankers in Florence. And Venice itself didn't really have any land. So there's that stream, but there's another stream that sort of works its way in through England. And it's this sort of idea of land ownership. And this definitely works its way into the American mindset. You can see Jefferson and Madison are thoroughly convinced of this, that land ownership conveys that sort of economic weight and social status, but that land ownership also facilitates certain Republican values.
Right. Yeoman virtues, that kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That they're self-sufficient and that they're independent. And there was also, and like if you look at the political debates in the 1790s among the Federalists and the Republicans, a lot of it just gets down to the Republicans were farmers and they were deeply suspicious of people whose money was not in land, that was in like paper, which for lack of it was in government paper or like bills of credit and things like that. They were deeply suspicious of those people for frankly not actually like working for a living. So there's sort of a mixture. I would say in the American mindset, there was definitely a conviction that land ownership and cultivation of your own property was like facilitated like the best type of citizen.
Yeah. Whenever circumstances force my wife to be with me in Penn Station in New York, my wife always mutters, "Jefferson was right about cities," which is some merit to that. Anyway, so you open the book with a discussion of sort of the thought processes of the founders at the Constitutional Convention, with a lot of emphasis on sort of Madison's methods or thinking about countering faction. So why don't you just walk us through that, and also with an eye towards today. We're recording this, for listeners, we're recording this last week, right after Kevin McCarthy was defenestrated from the speakership. We're not going to get deep in the weeds on that because there's a lot of ass clownery that can transpire between now and the time this airs that we don't want to be too dated on it. But when you think about the problems plaguing our country today, how adequate to the task are the mechanisms that people like Madison came up with to dealing with the problems that we have today?
Oh, those are good questions. Okay, so for starters, I lean on Madison not because the Constitution is Madison's creation. I lean on Madison, I think, for two reasons. I think that Madison was probably, among the founders, the men at the convention, was probably the deepest thinker on these issues. And also,
but Hamilton was a better rapper. We should just be clear about
he definitely was. I mean, yeah. Hamilton had his merits. So Madison was the deeper thinker. And Madison also does a really good job, I think, in the Federalist Papers of encapsulating the consensus view of the convention. Those are just judgment calls on my part. But I tend to think that Hamilton's the better writer, and I would gauge that in 1788, 89, Hamilton's essays were more persuasive than Madison's. Mm-hmm. But that I think Madison's, like if you look at 10 and 39 and 51, a couple other ones, they just sort of like, they're just more useful for us today in 2023. So anyway, so historically speaking, the idea of good government had long been premised on the notion of balance between factions in society. You can go all the way back to classical antiquity in this desire for balance. This is, for instance, one reason why Aristotle thinks the middle class is the best suited for a republic, because they're all in the middle, so it kind of creates a balance. And as that notion had evolved, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and we get in the Middle Ages, this kind of balance gets read through the medieval view of the sort of the three orders of society: those who pray, those who fight, those who work. Right. And so insofar as medieval governance has, I don't want to say democratic institutions, but are not simply absolute monarchies, usually see a balance between these factions. And the great example of that would be the British system, right? By the 1740s, Montesquieu is praising the British system for at least having the potential for liberty. And he praises the idea of the separation of powers, but also the fact that powers are separated between institutions that represent different social forces. So the House of Commons represents the middling landowners. The House of Lords represents the aristocracy and the high churchmen, right? So this is the sort of idea of balance. The problem the Americans face in 1776 is almost by default, they didn't really have a choice in this. That sort of medieval balance has to get thrown out the window. They don't really have a choice. George III and his German predecessors never bothered to create aristocracy in the United States of America. There were no peers, like there's no baron of like Pennsylvania here. So we don't have an aristocracy. And even if we did, again, we talked about this a minute ago, the idea of aristocracy being rooted in land in the United States would have made no sense. So there's that. Also, we just got rid of George III. So, we're not going to, what are we going to like bring over his nincompoop son? We're not going to do that. So we're left by default with just the people alone, right? Which if you go back to like Aristotle, like that's, the Greeks would like flashing warning lights, the people alone, like that's going to yield a democratic tyranny. It happens every time. And the Americans, this was not merely a theoretical problem for the Americans, but if you look at the history of the United States between 1776 and 1787, you begin to see the outlines of like a democratic tyranny. Like Shays Rebellion does kind of look like the rule of the mob, right? So the Americans are at that point, they're, what's the phrase? They're like flying without a net or whatever, right? They have to do something new. And what they do that is new is what I argue in the book is that rather than embrace the balance of these separate socioeconomic orders, they embrace the doctrine of consensus. And it boils down to this, put it very precisely. The larger, the broader, and the more durable a popular majority exists in favor of a given alternative, the more likely our Constitution will allow that alternative to become law. That was the basic bet that the founders made, is that yes, popular majorities are dangerous, but a large majority that consists of a geographic or socioeconomically broad cross-section of the country, that is also not a flash in the pan majority, that has been a deliberate majority, the issues have been well considered. A majority like that, it's not a guarantee, but is more likely than not, certainly, to want something that's legitimately in the public interest. And as an illustration of that, you can imagine, like, place yourself outside of time and consider a hypothetical where you don't know the specifics of the debate, the issue, anything. Just consider two majorities. One is a majority that is 218 votes in the House, 51 votes in the Senate. The other one is 300 votes in the House, 70 votes in the Senate. Which one is more likely in the public interest? Now, that you can go back to points in our country's history where the former is certainly more likely in the former would have been in the public interest. But over time, the smart bet would be to bet on the latter majority because it's bigger. And the bigger a majority, the more likely it is to be a beneficial one. And that was the bet the framers made, the idea of consensus. And that is how our Constitution takes the democratic impulse and channels it into a Republican, or at least endeavors to channel it into a Republican output by demanding consensus as a precondition to government action.
So isn't the key ingredient there, though, which is never explicitly stated in the Constitution as far as I know, but it's heavily implied, is time, right? It's a very Lincolnian thing. You can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time, right? And so over time, people come to their senses, but momentary passions are dangerous. So you create mechanisms that just take time to let a majority work its will, because the assumption being that the dirt is going to pan out from the gold pan over time as people come to their senses, despite momentary moments of rage or passion.
Yeah, I think that's a great way I like that analogy of the panning for gold. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And you can see this through a number of mechanisms. Like, for instance, our elections are set under law on a predetermined date. There's no snap elections in the United States of America. There's no opportunity for ambitious and cynical political majority to secure its hold on power by calling a snap election. You can't do that. And look, like and you can think of it this way too, like we in the United States of America have the sovereignty, we the people have the sovereignty to fire everybody in our government. We can get rid of the president. We can get rid of all 535 members of Congress, but it will take us 6 years.
Another way to think about it is technically you can amend the Constitution to do all sorts of terrible friggin' things. It's just really, really friggin' hard. And you got to get buy-in from all sorts of horizontal and vertical stakeholders. And the assumption being the process of debating that and getting the buy-in, the assent from so many people, that really bad ideas for amending the Constitution are not impossible, right? I mean, we did prohibition, but like it's hard, and it should be hard, right? And like this is the left's, long-standing, and now parts of the right's long-standing complaint about the Constitution was that why should the living people today be held hostage to a procedure if we decide, it's the problem of pre-commitment. Like we're bought into the system that makes it hard for current majorities of passion to get what they want. And to me, it's like, yeah, that's the point.
Right. It is the point. And look, I think the other thing too is that if you think about where one of the things I talk about in the conclusion of the book is that democracy and political sovereignty being the sole ownership of the people is now a hegemonic ideology in the Western world, right? There's no legitimate form of government that's under consideration. There's no alternative. Democracy is the only system that is deemed to be legitimate, which is a good thing. I'm not disagreeing with that. However, what I will say is that just because we have now deemed it the only legitimate one, it is hegemonic, but it is still potentially and often deeply problematic. And we cannot take for granted the potential problems of the democratic principle. Simply, and another thing too, I often think that people have too narrow a historical scope of things to say, well, look at the way Europe has done things. It's like, yeah, okay. Like, let's look at Europe since the 1950s. You want to go back before the 1950s? Because we can do that, and it's going to be a very different story. Like, let's talk about how Hitler was elected in, 1933, democratically elected. Let's talk about the French Revolution, all sorts of things we can talk about. And I think that when we take a broader view of history, we can appreciate the wisdom that has been within the Western tradition since classical antiquity, which is that there are great potentials in democracy. And I think now it's a fairly settled matter that democracy is the only legitimate input of government, but there are really enormous dangers to them. And they don't even have to be catastrophic. I mean, one of the examples that I give in the book is the Brexit vote. The Brexit vote happening in England, because England, with its unwritten constitution, was certainly less democratic than the United States was in 1789. But today in 2023, I mean, it's pretty close to it's pretty close to a simple democracy, what they have going over there. And I know a lot of conservatives, back when the Brexit vote was passed, conservatives were very pleased. But, from my perspective, I thought it was very problematic that a popular plebiscite could yield a result of 51-49 and result in sweeping changes. And, there have been downstream problems with this. Like one of the emerging problems is, frankly, if you're an Anglophile like myself, Scottish nationalism. The Scots are very displeased with Brexit. And, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, there was a plebiscite a couple of years ago in Scotland for Scottish independence that failed, but not nearly as overwhelmingly as I would have liked to have seen. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's another one, because the Scots are unhappy. That's a perfect illustration of the sort of thing that cannot happen in the United States of America. That for all intents and purposes, in a country, if the United States had a faction that was not a popular majority, but a substantial geographical and historically distinct entity like the Scots, you would not be able to enact a policy in the face of uniform Scottish opposition, like what the English did or what the British did. And so from my perspective, like the fact that we could, and this gets to your point a moment ago, Jonah, like we could do Brexit in the United States. We could do a version of Brexit, but it would take a very long, very serious, very deliberate conversation as a precondition. It would not be a simple snap plebiscite.
Yeah, just as a aside on the Brexit stuff. I mean, I think one of the ironies that it's funny, you know, I make fun of people who are cartoonishly anti-globalist, right? It's not to say I am globalist, but like, I don't think the globalists are putting chemicals in Kentucky Fried Chicken to make me crave it fortnightly, right? That's the Pentaveret anyway, and they're not particularly globalist. Anyway, the weird irony is that, you know, supranationalism, like the EU, actually fuels more nationalism. I don't mean in the United States necessarily, although there's a related argument there. There's no way that like the Basques, you know, or the Catalonians, or the Welsh, or the Scots, or would be talking about leaving Spain or the UK or any of these places, were it not for the fact that there was a larger supranational entity that would do a lot of the work that they need their local governments to do, right? So like they can handle the trade agreements, they can handle the foreign policy stuff, they can handle some of the military stuff. You take all that stuff out of the responsibility of a hyper-local mini national government, and all you're left with is tripling down on your cultural distinctiveness. And so you see it in Belgium, you see it in a lot of these places where the EU actually frees up a lot of minority sort of nation states within nation states to re-embrace their cultural and national distinctiveness that was sort of subsumed in the French government or the Spanish government or the British government. And I think that process is going to kind of continue. But all right, so let's get back to the States, though. I have many different ways I want to go with this. Let's start with the Electoral College, which is one of these institutions that was created to help forge this consensus, right? To sort of to even out electoral disparities between various regional populations and whatnot, and give the appearance and privilege the sovereignty of states over the sovereignty of just the individual voter. And a lot of people don't like it. I have been a passionate defender of the Electoral College for a very long time. It is becoming more difficult for me. I'm not exactly sure where you come down on Donald Trump, so I'll just put this in the abstract. A demagogue who can win intense and passionate majorities in a handful of states that picks the lock of the Electoral College, countervening the popular will, the decisive popular will that doesn't like the demagogue. That I thought was the kind of thing that wasn't supposed to be able to happen because of the Electoral College. And yet it feels like it could only happen because of the Electoral College now. How do you answer that? Because I need a better answer to that myself.
Yeah, well, I think for starters, I think that if you're going to have the occasional election where a president who doesn't win a popular majority nevertheless wins the Electoral College, I mean, that's just, if it's a one-off, okay, fine. But I think that you're right, especially with respect to Trump. Like right now, like if you look at the polls right now, Donald Trump is, for whatever those are worth, but the national polls have Donald Trump tied with Joe Biden or maybe a little bit ahead, which would probably point for Trump to be an Electoral College sweep, like just an absolute blowout. And Biden voters are quote unquote wasted. And I don't mean that in a moral sense. I mean that in a purely arithmetic sense. In places like California, in New York and Maryland and other places like that. Whereas the electorate is more evenly divided in these other states. I think that as defenders of the Constitution, I think we have to acknowledge that's a problem. And it becomes a problem, a more acute problem, the more power that the president wields, right? So that, like, you can imagine that the presidential office in 1789, that not being as big a deal as it is in 2023. I mean, especially because the president now effectively wields the lawmaking power, which is another issue altogether. But like, let's just put that aside for a moment. It's a problem. It's not a good thing. I would point out two choices that the political community has collectively made over the years that facilitate this. The first is, about 110 years ago, we capped the House of Representatives at 435 seats, which was
a mistake.
A mistake. It was a mistake. And what it does is it distorts the balance within the House of Representatives, because Wyoming and Vermont and the Dakotas get one seat regardless. And so that creates distortions there. If we were to and I think we should let the House of Representatives float. I mean, I think the German Bundesrat has like upwards of 700 members. I don't understand why that's so infeasible in our country. But if we were to do that, and we were to maybe anchor the minimum House seat as the size of Wyoming, that would ameliorate this tension, because it would give more power to California, frankly. That would be one thing that we could do, but we're not going. And this is the thing. We're not going to do that because it would be bad for members of the House of Representatives. So let's just be clear about why this is not happening. This would be an easy solution to align the Electoral College with the popular vote that the House of Representatives will never agree to, not for reasons of principle, but for reasons of interest.
Why don't you explain for listeners? I mean, I know what you mean, but why don't you explain for listeners why the Electoral College is tied to the size of the House?
Okay, so the reason it's tied to the size of the House of Representatives is that every state receives electors based on the total number of senators plus House members. So the more House members a state has, the more every state has a minimum of 3 electors, because every state gets 1 House member and they get 2 senators. And then after that, the number increases based on how many House members they have. So the only losers in this scheme is the existing members of the House of Representatives. As a matter of fact, it would actually be a good thing for aspiring would-be politicians, because it would create more political opportunities. Only people who would lose in this is House members. If we doubled the size of the House, then we're halving the power of the existing members of the House. But we could do that. We choose not to do that. If we have a method of dealing with this problem that doesn't require amending the Constitution, then we cannot say that it is a constitutional problem. The other thing we could do that we likewise choose not to do is we could apportion electors on something other than a winner-take-all basis. And indeed, if you look at the early elections, if you look at the elections of 1792, 1796, 1800, electors were not apportioned. In many states, they were not apportioned on a winner-take-all basis. We could choose to do a version of what Nebraska and Maine do, which is to give, and not that we should do it on the basis of who wins what congressional districts, because then then it's downstream of gerrymandering, and that's a problem. But you can imagine a scenario in which, let's say, a state has 10 electoral votes. One candidate wins 60% of the vote. Another candidate wins 40%. You can imagine giving the winner 7 of the electoral votes because he won 60%, give him an extra bonus because he wins a majority, and the other candidate gets 3. If we were to take both of those reforms, if we were to increase the number of the House of Representatives, thereby increasing the number of electors, and we increasing or transitioning to winner take all, transitioning away from winner take all, problem would disappear. We're not going to do either of those, though. Increasing the number of House members is bad for the House of Representatives. Increasing the size, getting away from winner take all, would be bad for both political parties. There is no universe in which the Republicans would agree to transition Alabama, or maybe better put Mississippi, away from winner take all to proportional. Likewise, the Democrats would never do that in California. So this is the problem here. It's not a constitutional issue. The problem here is really, the problem is the choices and virtue, frankly, of our political elites. The people in charge who talk about and this is where I get really pissed off, actually, because they talk a big game and they undermine the Constitution. They insult the Constitution. They insult the founding fathers. They delegitimize the Constitution by undermining public respect for it, while refusing to take to take the steps they could take because they're not in their short-term political interests.
Right. It's the Cosa Nostra versus Res Publica thing, right?
It's
and I just I would be remiss if I didn't point out I am one of the early charter members of the Expand the House of Representatives Club. The first op-ed I ever got published was for the Wall Street Journal in 1992 on expanding the House of Representatives to about 7,000 members.
I feel like that us AEI nerds, that's like our big like common thing.
There's a whole club. I mean, yeah. Sean Trendy's in, Lyman Stone's in. I mean, there are a bunch of us, and there's even this. I mean, you would know this stuff better than I do, but there's even this argument that the real First Amendment was about the size of congressional districts, and for whatever reason, the Egg Council prevented it from getting into the Constitution.
Yep.
The other thing, I mean, there are many things, but this is a good segue. One of the reasons to pick up on your righteous indignation about people who undermine the Constitution, I often say that the place where the founders really screwed up by not imagining that Congress would ever stop being a jealous guardian of its power and prerogatives. As you point out, it is a jealous guardian of its status, which is why it won't increase the number of seats, but they're not a jealous guardian of their prerogatives and their power and their responsibilities. And a lot of the problems that we have that has been undermining the Constitution for a very long time have been their willingness to outsource to the administrative state, to the executive branch more broadly or more narrowly, the president, and to the courts. And how do you fix that in a way consonant? Because like I thought, I'm a very much an Irving Kristol guy, and Irving Kristol, has this wonderful essay, the American Revolution as a Successful Revolution. And one of his central points is that the founders took account of human nature when they were constructing the government and the Constitution. And essential to that whole checking ambition and all that kind of stuff rests on the idea that Congress, the first branch of government, wouldn't voluntarily vomit up its responsibilities to the other branches. But that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah, it is what's happened. It's interesting in some respects. The office of president is peculiar, even in the original Constitution and the constitutional vision of it, because the decision to give the president a veto is actually, like, to my mind, was a very radical thing that they did, because the English sovereign had a veto, but for all intents and purposes, it was a nullity by 1787. The last sovereign to have vetoed a piece of legislation was actually Queen Anne in like 1711 or something. So they really rebooted this thing that had sort of laid dormant. You can see it in other ways too. There was a debate when they were creating the Department of State, because the Constitution doesn't say whether or not the president has the power to fire officials in government. And so there was a debate about, well, does he? And Madison was a vigorous defender of the fact that he does, that it's essential to the executive power. And Madison was worried that the president would get sucked into the legislative vortex. But I think that even early on, like if you read Madison's Federalist Essays on Congress and then skip ahead to Federalist 70, which is Hamilton's great treatise on energy in the executive, you can see, oh, here comes Hamilton. He's got his own idea of things. And like, wow, an energetic executive can really challenge the legislative branch in ways that I'm not sure that the founders, at least Madison was certainly caught off guard. I will say that Madison was 100% caught off guard by the energetic administration under Hamilton, when Hamilton effectively became Washington's prime minister in 1790. And I think that a couple things have facilitated this over the years. I think one of them is mass media. The president is able to speak in a single voice, which is something that Congress can't do. The other one is the development of the modern bureaucracy, which had not existed at the time, and that sort of falling under the hands of the executive branch. And I think that I'm not sure what the solution to that is, except that I would say that if there was a widespread expectation for Congress to wield these powers, Congress would take them back. Congress hands these powers over to the executive branch because I think that they're following public opinion. And I think that the public has, in the public's mind, the president is Article 1, even though in the framers' mind, Congress would be Article 1. And you can see this, I think you can see this most clearly in the difference between midterm turnout, presidential turnout, that people clearly see the presidential office as like almost sort of like, and I'm not sure people would use this phrase to describe their own feelings about it, like if you ask the average American. But I would say that they effectively see the president as a democratically elected monarch. And as long as the people see it, the president that way, Congress is going to behave like that because Congress is elected by those very same people. So, and what you get then is you get this weird, like this interfaces with party politics in a weird way, which is that like when there's a Republican president, all these Republican members of Congress are like slavishly devoted to enhancing the power of the president. And then when there's a Democratic president, they resist it. But the Democratic members of Congress then are devoted to the Democratic president. So the thing always only ratchets in one direction. And the real problem with all of it is that unwinding it would be virtually impossible because you have to overcome a presidential veto, which means the president would have to hand back authority that he's acquired. And I mean, maybe you could get a president willing to do that, but unless we stumble upon another Calvin Coolidge or like Grover Cleveland or Dwight Eisenhower, one of these people that doesn't fit the mold because they have this kind of like hyper Republican, small r Republican vision of the role of the executive branch. No president's going to hand back power. That's not what they're going to do. So the whole thing is just it's like a ratchet that only goes in one direction. You can't undo it, despite the fact that it just keeps getting more and more absurd. Like now, effectively, because now, I mean, look at what's going on the southern border. It's just like the law is the law, but the president's chosen to enforce the law in such a way that the law isn't the law anymore. It's a completely different law. I mean, there's nothing that and I guess the thing is that Congress does and always has, and unless the Constitution is amended, always will have the power of the purse, which could shut the whole thing down in a heartbeat, except that the people don't want Congress to do that. And that, I think, gets to the core problem. And that's sort of the last chapter of the book. It's sort of like, honestly, it's not that the Constitution is terrible. It's that the civic virtue is in the toilet. People don't understand the Constitution. They don't understand how it works. They don't understand what duties that they owe the state as citizens, and they're certainly not exercising their duties. And our problems stem not from the Constitution, but our problems really stem from our own failures to abide by the certain basic virtues that really any well-functioning republic requires of its citizens.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I don't often credit Barack Obama on a lot of things, but Barack Obama was pretty good when he would talk about how, look, the only thing that keeps the Constitution going is people's faith in the Constitution, and it's sort of, I wrote about this not long ago, this idea about using the 14th Amendment to bar Trump from office. I think it's a colorable argument. I think ultimately it's wrong, but politically it's bizarre because in a country where people rightly saw what Trump tried to do as disqualifying for office, you wouldn't need some legalistic magical incantation to justify keeping him off the ballot. He just wouldn't be on the friggin' ballot. The parties wouldn't let him on. No, people wouldn't vote for him. He would be shunned by society. But like in a society that's not willing to shun, or significant chunk of society is not willing to shun, and institutions like the Republican Party aren't willing to sort of protect their brand, relying on friggin' Lawrence Tribe to say abracadabra, I've solved the problem, is not only foolish on the merits, it's also politically, you want to get people even more crazy populist, tell them that the elites have figured out that if they incant the right words in the right way, they can deny you the ability to vote for the guy that you want to vote for. I mean, that will seem to a lot of normal people as rigging the system. And as much as, I'm in favor of any means, any means within the realm of the law-abiding and decent to keep Trump from being president of the United States, I think that's a really bad way to do it.
I agree. And I think, I think that there has been a collapse in, I would say it's sort of multifaceted. Like, I think that the quality of our political elites now compared to what they were in generations past is very low. I think our elites lack wisdom. I think they lack real wisdom. I think they lack virtue. I mean, Yuval Levin has made a good point about this, that like political elites view these offices as almost kind of like notches on a bedpost, rather than trusts that they're supposed to occupy, right? And I think that has undermined faith among the mass public, especially because the government keeps screwing stuff up. They keep over-promising and under-delivering. You do that for long enough, you're going to get a populist uprising. But at the same time, though, I agree with you. Like, I mean, this is, if the people want Trump, I mean, you can't just like, Larry Tribe says you can't have Trump, the end. The issue is like, okay, you want him, you got him, I mean, because that's at the end of the day, it's a republic, it's like Mencken, the democratic theory is the people deserve to get, they deserve to get what they want. They deserve to get it good and hard, and I think as a political community, I would say that we're not doing the sorts of things that we're supposed to be doing as citizens of a republic. I don't think we have the values that we're supposed to have as citizens of a republic. I think it's shocking to me to contemplate it, especially because it happens so slowly over the course of my adult lifetime. But like this whole idea of like owning the libs or owning the cons, like there is now like a political like satisfaction to be taken, not from a policy win, but from simply making your political opponents miserable. That is now a goal. Like, that's insane. That is a level of factionalism that if you ask the great philosophers of Western history, of the Western canon, they would say, oh, that's poison. Like factionalism is always a problem in democratic systems of government. It has to be controlled. And you're telling me that we're now at the point where one faction considers it a victory just if they make the other faction suffer. That is really bad. And it's just common now. It's what we do. We own the libs.
Right. I mean, like, I had my problems with the Hastert rule, but I understood it as a politically pragmatic thing. If for listeners who don't know, the Hastert rule just says that, first of all, any rule named after Dennis Hastert is maybe one you want to rethink just on branding purposes alone. But it held that, you had to have a majority of support for legislation to bring it to the floor from your own party, right?
From your own party.
And I get it. Okay. I'm not sure that's right, but I can see for practical purposes why a party would do that. Now, like, part of Matt Gaetz's argument for why McCarthy had to go was that he used Democratic votes to forestall a government shutdown. And there's no basis for that idea having any credibility in American history. The idea that an important and significant piece of legislation, if it's passed by a bipartisan majority that is supported by the majority of your own caucus, right? But also a majority of the other party, it becomes illegitimate because the other party voted for it too? I mean, like, what major legislation that we can all agree was good passes that test? I mean, it's bizarre. And now, like, you try to talk about policy reform and people say, well, yeah, but the problem is voters aren't interested in policies, right? You cannot campaign. You watch these Republican debates and people are talking about this policy versus that policy. What they want is pound of flesh from the other team. And whoever can promise the most flesh from the other team wins. That's cuckoo.
It is cuckoo. It is. And I think the thing too is that politics is increasingly being driven by, on 20% of the population on both ends of the ideological spectrum.
Right.
Maybe 30%, but at the very least, there is a wide, so the two wings want, as you said, a pound of flesh as a policy victory. And then there's the broad middle of the country that is losing faith, if they have any faith left in our institutions of government. That doesn't make any sense either. I think, we can talk about, we've talked about this before, Jonah. We've talked about institutional reform. You and I think have both talked about we're living in an era of weak parties and strong partisanship. I think all of that's true, but I think the core problem I really increasingly think the core problem is us. Like, not you and me personally. Because that'd be easy. If the problem was you and me personally, we could just send the two of us into exile and all of our problems, the problem is the American people and particularly the most engaged Americans have a set of values that are not conducive to or do not correspond with constitutional values. And I think that that's the case on both sides of the aisle in Congress. And it's that the reason why that's the case is because the people who exercise most sway over who sits in Congress versus who doesn't sit in Congress are those people.
Obviously, I agree with that. But one cannot throw one's hands up in despair and say, you quote Mencken, I'll quote Ed Koch. When Ed Koch lost for his third bid for mayor of New York, he was asked if he was ever going to run again. And he said, no, the people of New York fired me and now they must be punished. And I've been quoting Edmund Burke, examples, the school of mankind, and will learn it no other for 20 years. It's sometimes you have to show people their folly for them to understand their folly. But in the process, you can have a lot of ruin. And so your answer about why Congress is the way Congress is because, and I largely agree with you, is that we have an idolatrous conception of the presidency. And that's a hard thing to unwind. And I think it does have to do with our lizard brains. And also the way modern media works, where media, for its own reasons, wants to reduce political issues to contests between personalities. The president versus whoever, everything's a MacGuffin for the president to win or lose, and the actual policy doesn't really matter. The McCarthy Gates thing got boiled down to a McCarthy Gates thing rather than all sorts of other issues that were at play and all that. That said, Yuval, he makes the case often that, the essence of getting back to this human nature point is that politicians haven't lost an interest in getting reelected.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that the way the game theory works now is that the point of vulnerability is no longer a general election, it's a primary.
Right.
And so the bare minimum to avoid getting primaried in all but 50 seats, something like that.
You should be fine.
You'll be fine, right? And so figuring out an incentive structure that makes the median voter, the persuadable middle voter, who by definition, that's the voter that you need to have a majority party, right? Again, this is all out of the Yuval Levin hymnal, but both parties simultaneously have this dysfunctional schizophrenic view that says elections are so close, they're this close to being a majority, so all we need to do is double down or triple down on our most committed voters, and that'll get us into power. And they're not wrong, because that's what's happened for the last 30 years. But at the same time, that logic prevents them from thinking they could ever get 60% of the vote. And so they never reach out beyond their coalition, which means that once they get in power, they swing for the fences as if this is their last chance to ever be in power, and they want to get all these things done before they're thrown out of power. And the process of doing that guarantees they get thrown out of power at a backlash at their overreach. And so you have this pendulum swinging. I mean, how many times has Congress changed hands in the last 25 years?
Oh, my goodness. All the time.
And the parties control the White House. I mean, we used to have a stability where the Democrats had the House for 40 years because they knew how to be a majority party. Neither party now knows how to be a majority party. And that keeps them being, it's two moons rather than a sun and moon party system now. And so, like, what would you do to fix either the primary system or some other component that's not not changing the Constitution? Don't want to be too normative there. That you think would align interests in a way that allows the Constitution to function more properly?
Well, I think that the great institutional mechanism that we invented after the Constitution they were the political parties. The problem with the political parties, though, and this has always been the problem with the political parties, is that if you contrast the creation of the parties to the Constitution was, in a certain sense, created outside of time, right? Like there was nobody occupying the office of president when they created the presidency, right? Nobody knew what was going to happen when they presented it to the people. So nobody was, like, when they were designing the Senate, nobody was calculating their own self-interest of how can I get into the Senate, right? At least if they were, the calculations would have been so fanciful that they probably didn't influence them. The political parties, on the other hand, were not created outside of time. They were created in time and space, and they were created in the first instantiation. They were created to solve the problems of political elites in the next election. The parties can, in theory, serve the constitutional republic. They can provide big, enduring benefits. However, the problem is that party reform and party creation has often usually been a function of short-term calculations by political agents looking out for their own interests. A good example of that would be George McGovern. After the 1968 Democratic Convention debacle, the establishment within the Democratic Party agreed to a commission to study party reform that was co-chaired by George McGovern, the senator from South Dakota. And McGovern helped guide a reform process that then he was able to immediately use upon the completion of it to win the nomination. This has been a consistent problem with parties. Parties and that's one consistent problem with parties. Another consistent problem with parties, this is a very ancient prejudice, which is that parties are seen as unseemly, inappropriate, and the sign of a republic that is malfunctioning. That's an old idea that goes way back before the United States of America. Very few people are willing to come out and say, no, parties are actually a good thing. Good, well-organized parties are a good thing. And I think that there has been collectively within the American public a lack of candid consideration of the proper role of parties in political life, both on what are parties supposed to do, and then how are they supposed to do it. And I think probably the way the rubber hits the road on this more than any other issue is campaign finance. Is that the public has a naive understanding of campaign finance. And so anytime politicians present to the public over the last 50 years, you present to the public limitations on money in politics, people respond instinctively yes, because they feel like money in politics is icky and dirty and should be gotten rid of, right? But and you take those two impulses: parties are icky, parties are kind of corrupt, money in politics is bad, and you get the McCain-Feingold bill, which I think more than anything else explains any single thing. I'm not saying it's like a 50% or greater causal factor. But I think of all of the reasons that our parties are so deranged right now is because McCain-Feingold blew up the traditional role that parties had as a clearinghouse for campaign money. And instead, what's happened is that campaign money has been scattered to the four winds. And you saw this with the Gates thing. Matt Gates was financing off of this. And it just goes to show that guys like second-rate wannabes like Matt Gaetz can nevertheless build out their own independent financial networks now because the parties have been defenestrated. The parties have effectively been removed from the financing of campaigns, when in fact, I would argue that the financing of campaigns is the most central function of the political party. And was almost from the very beginning. That's what the parties did. I mean, we can go back and look at the problems of political patronage in Jacksonian America, for instance. And yeah, there were a lot of problems, but at its core, patronage was party-directed public financing of campaigns. We got rid of that because it was icky. We got rid of party financing of campaigns, and now what do we have? We have small donor financing of campaigns. And the small donors are exactly the people that we were talking about, the people who crave the pound of flesh from the opposition. Whereas before, when the parties were directing campaign finance, the incentive structures were completely different. And I'm not saying that that's the be all end all. And I'm not necessarily promoting any specific reform over another. I would make two things that I would say definitively, or I say with a high degree of personal confidence. McCain-Feingold was a bad law because it blew up the party financing of politics, and number one. And number two, collectively as a country, and I would say among public intellectuals, collectively, we need to spend a lot more time thinking about what strong parties look like and trying to create the permission structure for the parties to look more like what that is as opposed to what they are today.
Yeah, this sort of brings us back to the whole concept of small r Republican, right? Is that the parties were supposed to be gatekeepers. They're supposed to be the first line of defense against demagogues. I mean, Elaine Kamarck has made this point a bunch of times where, in the pre-primary era, if you went if we had the pre-primary rules, right, where basically governors or some other boss of a state controlled the delegation. And you went in and said, hey, I'm going to run for president. And he's, well, what are you going to do? And I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to make Mexico pay for it. I'm going to ban Muslims from the country. He just ran through that kind of list. The guy would get the hell out of my office, And similarly, if Bernie Sanders went in and said, well, I'm going to seize the means of production and nationalize the television stations and the oil fields, he's get the hell out of my office, right? And that gatekeeper function. So I agree with you entirely about campaign finance. McCain was an honorable man, but it was a bad law. And the reason it was a bad law was his personal honor was so tied up in the issue, he couldn't see straight on it. But McConnell had it right. He said, look, this law isn't going to get money out of politics. It's going to get the parties out of politics. And he was 100% right. That said, it's sort of like, one of my favorite Orwell lines, I quote it all the time, is that a man can feel himself to be a failure and take to drink and then become all the more of a failure because he drinks. The primary system, which was serviceable, not great, but serviceable in the pre-McCain-Feingold era, is now just a complete hot mess. And, France recently changed its electoral law, and I haven't looked at it too closely, but basically, we are the only country in the world where parties don't get to explicitly pick their own candidates. And we get this, when Jeremy Corbyn got to be head of the Liberal Party, it was because they changed the rules to say you can just show up and pay a £1 entrance fee. And all of the hives of scum and villainy throughout British politics emptied out. And these guys came in and they elected this anti-Semitic, Bolshevik as the head of the party. And parties used to have this fiduciary obligation to think about the long-term value of their brand. And I think our friend and colleague Ross Douthat had it right, is that the parties, the combination of the primary system and the campaign finance stuff, have turned the parties into fueled jetliners sitting on the runway waiting to be hijacked. And I don't know, and I like to think about the eternal wisdom of the Constitution, and I like your description of it being written out of time and space, but you need some, and the third component I would say is the obsession with transparency. This idea that, the reason why Congress is supposed to be the place where politics happens, where stakeholders adjudicate, negotiate, horse trade, whatever. That's what politics is, right? Is negotiating and trading things. And you cannot negotiate in front of cameras. And so I was just writing about this today, but like when Gates had this famous line in Vanity Fair a couple of years ago where he said, the reason why he does all of this TV is because he needs to make news. And if you're not making news, you're not governing. And his argument there is that if you're not a jackass on TV, you're not getting attention, and therefore you're not, quote unquote, governing. And I've given him a hard time for a very long time about that. But it shouldn't be shocking that, what's his face from Utah, who went on to become a Fox News pundit, or Trey Gowdy, who I like, who went on to become a Fox pundit. The difference between being a Fox pundit and being a member of Congress has shrunk, because when you have all this transparency, all Congress becomes is this platform to be performative on and to be a pundit anyway. It's a parliament of pundits. Why not get better paid and have a bigger audience away from the C-SPAN cameras by going on MSNBC or Fox? And those three things, the transparency, the money, and the primaries, I think combine for why we can't have nice things.
Yeah. One of the things that I often think about is when you think about the scope of American political history, there is a lot of things that they did in the past badly. One of the key failure of previous generations was to employ an insufficient, their understanding of the citizen was too narrow. Like it was originally limited to white male property holders, then white men, and then the former enslaved community, but they didn't have the protections. And so there's this sort of tendency to go back in time and to think that, everything they did in the past was naive or benighted because their understanding of the citizenry was too narrow. I think that's wrong. And I think that when we control for that and say, okay, so let's just stipulate that their understanding of the scope of citizenship was too narrow. How did they envision the citizenry interacting with each other? Putting aside the reality that the definition of citizen was too narrow. And I think when you do that, you begin to see a lot of practices that we have since thrown out, a lot of 19th century practices of politics, actually make a lot of freaking sense. I think the original design of the Electoral College makes sense. Like the idea of electors being appointed by the state legislatures and the electors having 2 votes for president. So that, it makes sense. It was clunky, but we threw it out. And now, you can't do that now. We have to have direct democracy. Or, like you look at the way in which Abraham Lincoln secured the nomination in 1860, basically promising Simon Cameron the Department of War. Okay, yeah, was that a little messy? Yeah, it was. But like, look at how we do it now. It's ridiculous now. And there's this, we've had this weird impulse in the country over the last, I don't know how long, but a while now, is that the more small d democratic our institutions are, the better, right? Especially with, we have to get rid of any intermediaries whatsoever. And that's faulty because, in a lot of cases, the public is not well suited to make these decisions for themselves without a little mediation. Mediation is not necessarily a bad thing. Right? Yeah, even the very notion of representative government implies mediation and implies that the people cannot govern themselves directly. They have to have mediators, right? And we've just sort of gotten rid of these mediators for the sake of more democracy. And what do we get? We get, we end up being having this ridiculous, absurd process that serves the interests of the political community not at all. And so I look back at the 19th century and the way they practiced politics, and I think, they didn't have electricity, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have iPhones, but they understood how politics should function in a way that we do not. They understood how to, there's something about it as well. They understood that people have been talking about this a while now, the importance of bargaining between different factions and things like that. This is just something that's anathema to us, but just sort of happened in the 19th century, for much of the 19th century. It's completely beyond our scope of understanding now. That is something that I wonder about. We've become more democratic, but we've become we're not really very good at politics. I think, as a community anymore. Like we're just not good. We used to be good at politics, but I would say, I don't know, it's happened very slowly, but I feel like we've gotten very bad at politics. And politics is increasingly, I think, becoming more like a religion for Americans, which is a terrible way for politics to be. Like politics is not religion. Religion is religion. Like if you want religion, go to synagogue on Saturday, go to church on Sunday. Politics is the place where we find common ground with each other. And we don't do that on anything. And we don't do that in Congress. We don't do that in our nomination process. We don't do that on Facebook with each other.
Yeah. I mean, the part of, I think, on the religious aspect of it is there's this secular trend towards victimization, which leads to an entitlement mindset, right? But it also leads to a kind of martyrology. And so you see this in like the way the House Freedom Caucus types, or at least a lot of them, negotiate, which is to say, like they had the debt ceiling fight. McCarthy got some wins in that, not huge wins, not like world historic wins, but some wins, right? They made a deal with the Democrats. Simply by virtue of securing a win, if you believe that the system, the regime, the deep state, whatever it is inherently evil and corrupt and fallen, then any win is evidence of collaboration with the enemy and therefore contemptible. The only way to prove purity is to lose, right? And so Matt Gaetz last Sunday had the great line where he said, look, defeat is not surrender. And he was bragging about, how his team lost on this budget deal, the government shutdown thing, but they were defeated. They didn't surrender, right? Because if you don't surrender, like the Jews at Masada, better, like cutting a deal with the Romans, that's illegitimate. Committing suicide, thumbs up, man, right? That's the sort of approach.
Right.
All right, we're going long, but I do want to ask this, and you can take it any direction that you want. This book came out, and the book is great. People should get it. I think people can tell I'm a fan of yours. The book was born out of these essays, The Conservative Case for the Constitution. All in favor of conservative case for the Constitution. I still think that I don't think the Constitution and the founding necessarily are the sum total of what conservatism is about or what it's supposed to conserve. But you take it out, and the whole thing collapses, right? In my view, for modern American conservatism, that's got to be as close as we're ever going to get to a fundament, right? It's sort of like my view that conservatism is about more than classical liberalism, but you can't take the classical liberalism out of it, right? If conservatism isn't going to conserve that, then what's the point? And I get why people like you, people like me, make conservative arguments in defense of the Constitution. 2 points. One, don't you think there's a burning need for a liberal defense of the Constitution? Right. I mean, or a progressive case for the Constitution, because they're the ones, like, you tell a progressive, hey, I'm making the conservative case for a Constitution. And it's like, well, you're just reinforcing my view that the Constitution is this conservative dead letter relic that we need to get rid of. And then simultaneously, you have people now on the right who are growing to hate the Constitution for the same reasons that the left, historically, the radical left has. Right. And there's a current of radicalism running through the right that is as opposed to norms, and I always get made fun of, what about your norms and all that kind of stuff. It's so opposed to, it's so catastrophizing and apocalyptic about the illegitimacy of the regime, right? I mean, I've given up telling people stop referring to the friggin' Biden regime. The Constitution is the regime. It's the Biden administration.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
If conservatives don't defend the Constitution, no one will. How optimistic are you that the Constitution is going to survive? Again, time is an issue. If this moment continues much longer, how worried are you that the Constitution, I mean, it'll still be there, but how enduring will it be for the reasons that it should be enduring?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess on the one hand, part of me is worried. People don't understand the Constitution, for starters. That was one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I really kind of wrote it for young people, like students, So as this sort of like when they were young, read this book and get a sense of the logic of the Constitution. But I think the average American doesn't understand the Constitution. I think, historically, regimes that don't have widespread public buy-in and that do not seem to be functioning the way they're supposed to are vulnerable, because it's not simply a matter of, well, it's a legitimate regime because it's a democratic regime and democracy is ipso facto legitimate. No, that is certainly an argument for legitimacy, but there's also the argument of Julius Caesar was legitimate because the Roman Republic was collapsing and he picked it back up and got things working again. So Caesar Augustus was legitimate in a way that, the Republic was not, because the Republic was floundering. And so and you could look at Bonaparte the same way. You could look at Bonaparte overthrowing the Directory as not that the Directory was democratic, but that is a concern that I have, which is sort of if the government continues to the number that really bothers me more than anything else in sort of all of the polling is how bad the right track, wrong track numbers are. And how it's sort of been 2-to-1 wrong track versus right track for, a long time now, for 20 years. And also, Gallup will periodically ask people, do you have a high degree of confidence? Do you have a low degree of confidence in these institutions? And I mean, Congress always scores low, but the number of institutions that are scoring low now has increased. And this is the sort of this is the sort of institutional weaknesses that, at least from a historical perspective, can be exploited by cunning individuals or cunning factions. And I do think the thing about Donald Trump is that he's basically just like a nincompoop. I think in 2016, he was basically like the dog that caught the bumper. I don't see him the way people on the left often saw him, as this dark stooge of Putin. I never bought that. But I do worry about somebody being like that, seeing cynically the weaknesses in the regime or the regime of the Constitution. And, it's not to say, oh, that could never happen here. Why? Why couldn't it happen here? What makes us so different? What makes us different from Rome? If anything, Rome was, had lasted longer than we've lasted as a republic. So what makes us different? Why couldn't it happen? That does worry me. I am worried. And I think that this is, I guess, as a response to liberals, it's sort of you gotta really, everybody, the left and the right, and you gotta really appreciate, in the grand scheme of things, how impressive the Constitution is as an instrument of government, how well it's worked for how long. And I really feel like there's a lot of taking things for granted. I think more than it, I look at a guy like Matt Gaetz and I look at him as taking things for granted. He takes for granted that you can just take down a speakership because the country will be fine and he can get ahead on it. And I see a lot of that. Now.
He's a free rider. I mean, that's we have free rider problems everywhere you look. Yeah.
And he assumes, his conscience is untroubled by the prospect that he's undermining the system, because he just assumes, well, the system's always been there and it'll always be there, so I can take what's mine and not worry about it. And it's just historically, I mean, you can sort of see how, no, that's actually not true. There are systems of government that have collapsed from if you look, this was Machiavelli's argument in the Discourses on Levies. Basically the idea is that governments collapse republics tend to collapse from the inside, that you shouldn't assume that you're going to escape that fate. And that is something that really bothers me nowadays, I think, is that I don't think that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was that as an instrument of government, as a regime, as you said, and I like the way you said that, as a regime, the Constitution is freaking awesome. It is an amazing achievement. It is the pinnacle of Enlightenment political thought, in my opinion. And and it asks, and this is the thing that where I get worked up. It asks things of us. It asks us to do things. It expects us to behave as citizens in a certain manner. And we have not been doing that. Our political elites have failed to do that. And increasingly, the average citizen is failing to do that. And we should not just assume that everything is just going to continue as it has through our lifetime because it's worked so far. Like, it requires maintenance. And I don't see an effort. I don't, you know what I don't see, Jonah, more than anything else? I don't see the reverence for the instrument of government that we, and this is the thing, we are, to quote my favorite underground bloggers, the Flapper guys, like, we are legatees. Like, we inherited this. You and I did nothing to create the Constitution. We were born into it. Like, we owe it to future generations to make sure that they get to be born into this system of government like we were. And are we as a civilization, as a people, doing that? No, we're not doing it. And we need to do better? Yes, we need to do better. And if we don't start doing better soon, we should not assume that everything will just be fine.
All right, with that, Jay Cost, I joked with you beforehand when yesterday you DM'd me on Twitter and was like, well, given the news today, it'll be an interesting conversation. And I was like, yeah, maybe we'll just do the intros and then drink hemlock.
Yep.
And we didn't do that, but now it's maybe time for the hemlock.
Yep.
So,
cheers.
Jay Cost, thanks so much for being here. Always a pleasure. And I hope you'll come back.
Thank you, Jonah. Thanks for having me. Jonah, I just want to thank you as well for all your support over the years. I really appreciate it. And I'm always delighted to be on The Remnant, and just thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay. This was a lot of boxes on the bingo card to fill in kind of episode of The Remnant, but I thought it was great. I think Jay is great. I think the book is great. And if we had another 20 minutes, I would have picked up where he was winding up and say, it's not so much the reverence, it's the need for gratitude, which was the point of my book, and when he talks about, Constitution requires maintenance, so does civilization, so do republics. And you only maintain things that you have some degree of gratitude for, some things that you feel lucky to have, that you feel fortunate to have. It doesn't necessarily have to be luck. It can be that you worked hard for it and you want to preserve it because you find it lovely and want it to be around for your kids and your grandkids. And that comes from gratitude. And we don't teach a lot about gratitude these days. We teach a lot about entitlement. And entitlement is the opposite of gratitude, because entitlement says you're owed something regardless of whether you deserve it or whether you work for it, but it's simply by virtue of who you are or what you're complaining about. And I think that the stuff that Jay is talking about the undermining of the constitutional order and of citizenship, stem from the pervasive ingratitude of our culture. But you've all heard me on that before. Anyway, it's great to talk to you guys, and I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.